Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. I'm JP Nurbin, joined by my friend and co-host Nate Sanderson. This week, we're diving into a discussion around supporting the multi-sport athlete and also how to manage some of those difficult relationships with other coaches in other sports. Now, while I recognize this episode is not going to apply to all our listeners, our collegiate and professional coaches, or even some of our international coaches, this has been one of the biggest pain points this summer for coaches in the TOC community and many of the listeners to the podcast. And that's what we like to get into each week on this podcast, the real challenges we face in coaching and leadership. And we work hard to provide some new ways of thinking about these challenges and new ways of operating through them. Just a quick note, if you want to get the notes to this podcast, we have a weekly newsletter that gives you a short leadership tip or tool and our notes from the episode. To subscribe, go to tocculture.com. All right, let's get right into today's episode.
Well, JP, if you've interviewed for a high school coaching position, there's one question that you are guaranteed to be asked, and that is, what do you do to support the multi-sport athlete? How do you encourage your players to play multiple sports and be involved in other activities? And we're not going to go through all the research that supports the idea that it benefits the players, it benefits our young people, both mentally and physically. But I think we're going to come at this conversation from a little bit different perspective, because while we can agree it's great for players, and I think it makes our basketball players, quite honestly, better teammates and better basketball players when they participate in softball or volleyball, it does create some other challenges that sometimes kind of get swept under the rug, or they get hidden in the closet, and they don't get really talked about a lot when it comes to the cost in terms of time and commitment and sharing of athletes. That can be a very difficult challenge for coaches in different contexts. When we think about the context of the multi-sport athlete today, particularly for skill sports, it's a different challenge maybe than it was 20 years ago when I started coaching, because now so many sports are a 10 to 12 month commitment per year. Like when you're asking a player just to go run track and then, maybe throw a baseball and then go out for football and run a couple pass patterns, but that's 4 months at a time. That there's time during the year for them to do those things almost separately, and then they can layer on top whatever they would like to do in addition to that. Now it's almost assumed that the commitment to playing at the varsity level, or certainly to be able to go on to another level, requires this greater investment. And given the commitment that many of us are asking for our own athletes, that 10 months out of the year to play our sport, is it even possible, or does it negate some of the advantages of playing a multi-sport when the commitment is so large to playing each individual sport? And JP, I know you and I have talked here over the last week or so about this, and want to start this conversation here of what are ways that we can be better about supporting the multi-sport athlete before we even get into some of the conflicts that we experience between other sports.
Yeah, and I don't think I work with a single coach out there that doesn't want multi-sport athletes. I think this is just kind of pretty much a given. At the same time, I know that for some teams to be really, really competitive at a high level, they do want a few that might be just exclusively committed to just their sport. I think the challenge that I see within us as coaches is, first off, this concept of the optional offseason. And in high school athletics, the offseason commitment and participation in most situations has to be optional. It can't be mandated. And I think a lot of coaches say, hey, it's optional. But then when players don't show up to off-season workouts, we really get bothered by it. We start to question their level of commitment, their level of passion, their level of interest in the sport. And we start to really get frustrated. And so I think the first place is, if we're saying it's optional, do we really treat it as optional? Like, is it optional in our mind? Or when a player doesn't come up there, do we start to make certain judgments about those individuals? We don't even have to communicate those judgments. But what I've seen in my own experience is that when players don't show up, I start to really reach out a lot and start to, hey, where are you? How are you doing? There's a lot of check-ins. And I'm sure it feels like to many of those players, well, coach says it's optional, but he clearly has an issue that I'm not able to attend all these different things. So I think just really reflecting on how we make it feel for our players in the off season. Is it optional? Are they encouraged to participate? But do we show understanding when they choose to participate in other activities, other sports, other pursuits in life? And I think this is the other challenge for us as a coach, all of us. We want to make a great program. We want to help our players to reach their full potential. And so I think as coaches, we're constantly trying to offer as many opportunities for them to improve as possible. And I think that's a great thing. Even if we're not in the gym, we might have assistant coaches or trainers that come in and help to provide these opportunities. I think the challenge with that is when we provide opportunities 10 to 12 months of the year, we never really give a lot of our players an off season. And not only does that potentially lead to burnout, but when they want to participate in another sport, they're often faced with the decision. Well, do I go to this or do I go to that? Or do I try to do both? And then all of a sudden you're just, 5-6 hours of some sports in a day for some of these kids. And I mean, that's been my experience of what we're expecting, especially during the summer months of in the States where it's just absolutely blazing hot. I'm not even sure that's like really healthy for a lot of individuals. But I really think we have to start this place from of reflecting on two big things, Nate. How does it feel for our players in the off season? Are they feeling the pressure and expectations to constantly be at everything? And secondly, is offering stuff 10 to 12 months a year for our players always the best thing?
Well, JP, here's a phrase that I've heard coaches say before to players about the offseason. The offseason is optional, but so is your playing time, right? Like every state in the union has a rule that says you can't mandate attendance in the offseason. And yet we find all kinds of creative and subtle ways to be able to communicate that to players that if they don't show up, well, we're going to honor the ones that are there. If it's a tie between two players for a position, we might have in our handbook. I had this in my handbook for years that we would go with the player that showed the biggest commitment in the offseason. That was going to be the tiebreaker. But, as I've gone along in my career, and I've done this for 20 years now, there's been enough stories of players who either one, have put in a ton of time in the offseason. 4 years, I can think of a couple of players and never got a starting job at the varsity level. Or on the other side of it, players that took an entire summer off because of injury and came back and became all conference players. And so I don't know, even in the math that we sometimes do in our head where we think, all right, I've said this before, JP, I don't know how to get better at basketball if our kids aren't playing basketball. I think there's some truth to that. Obviously, that there is something required for them to get better because everybody else is, and we feel that pressure as well. But at the same time, the question that I've started wrestling with more recently is how much is enough rather than what more can we do? And I think even that shift in perspective can be beneficial, particularly for those kids that are trying to juggle multi-sports.
Well, I think the big challenge here is that we look at everything from the perspective, like we start with this question when we're trying to build our program of what is it going to take for us to win? And then we try to put this plan in place from in season to off season that's going to give us the best chance to reach our potential on the court, to go as far in the tournament as we possibly can. And I think the alternative approach that you've encouraged me on in some of our conversations is just to start with this question around what's best for our kids. What's best for the athlete and the individual within my circumstances and my context? And it may be that 12-month plan that you've dreamed up and you've built over the course of the last few years. It may be that depending on your circumstances. We work with a lot of teams that are high level at the high school or, youth level. And, whether it's a hockey academy or a nationally ranked basketball program where the players are all exclusively one sport. That makes sense. Okay. You got your dream plan, go with it. But for a lot of situations out there, that dream plan, what's best to maximize your team's performance, may not be actually doable. And it may actually not be what's best for them as individuals and their development. And so I think that we need to ask both those questions. And we really need to maybe take a look and compare the notes on what's best for them as individuals and people and what's best for the team's, performance long-term.
And I think that becomes a difficult question for some of us because I don't know that there's a specific answer of, well, if kids have X, Y, and Z, then we know this is going to make them the healthiest individuals compared to playing softball year round and basketball year round, et cetera. And really what you're describing there is, at least in my interpretation, is what's the opportunity cost, for my daughter to play 6 months of basketball, 7 months of softball, and 6 months of volleyball, throughout the course of her high school, middle school, or even later elementary school athletic life. Well, I was just talking to a friend of mine over the weekend who has 8 kids, which is a whole other story in and of itself. But nevertheless, like, he's kind of in the midst of all this, right? Like, trying to sort out, what opportunities do we give our kids and what sacrifice do we want to make as a family? What are they missing out on if they go on this travel team? Or, obviously they can't, as 2 parents with 8 kids, go to every single event. So they're trying to balance all this. And one of the things that he said at the end of this conversation was, there are important things that our kids have to learn outside of sport. Like, what do you do when you're bored? Like, how do you come up with games on your own, having unstructured time to play and being able to do their chores and having responsibilities, that some kids, they don't have a lot of that because they're constantly being shuttled around, having activities that aren't structured by adults. All of those things, the research would say, benefits the growth and development of kids. And I think sometimes we have to be a little bit cognizant of, are we asking so much that they're missing out on some of those natural opportunities to help them grow as well?
There's something you said a little bit earlier too. You just reflecting back on some past seasons around how some of your players came in, they did everything that you could have asked them, and they still never could crack into this starting 5. And then you got those other players that, didn't touch a ball for like 6-7 months. They show up and they're just able to pick it up, and they've got a great energy and they're competitive and they're all about it. I think that really mirrors some of my experience as well too. And I think I often took the wrong approach mentally as a coach. I'd often be like, man, but they could be so much better if they spent all this time in the off season, instead of like, this is just where they're at. This is what they do in life. They had a summer job. They play other sports. I think it, reminds me of our conversation with Captain Mike Abershoff that we had in the early 100 episodes. And Abershoff had took over the Benfold, and one of the approaches that he took with all 310 sailors on his ship was to come at them from, how would I treat them if this was my own son or daughter? And I think if we can approach the off season with that type of mentality and that type of grace and understanding, and just really try to treat every individual as if they were our own son or daughter. Well, when we want them to play multiple sports, we want them to pursue other interests, I think it drastically changes our mindset as coaches, rather than just always approaching it from the coach that's trying to maximize his team's performance. Because as a parent myself, I don't think I'm really that concerned with any of my children reaching peak performance in any specific sport. I'm just more interested in them pursuing their interests and passions. And if they happen to be really passionate about one sport in particular, and that's all they want to do, that's fine. But if they have other interests, other passions, other things in life that interest them, then I want to constantly try to nurture as many of those things as they can manage and balance within their life in a healthy way.
JP, I think one of the challenges with this is we don't really even know how to think about the off-season athlete that's participating in other sports. And let me kind of explain what I mean by that. There's different philosophies, when it comes to the expectations for our athletes in the off-season. One is, the Bill Belichick approach. I was just listening to a podcast with Matt Castle on, who played for Belichick for a number of years. And they were talking about, what's the first couple of days of training camp like in New England? And they're just getting ready to start up here again this fall. And Castle said, well, Belichick comes in and he gives a version of the same speech every year. He basically says, it doesn't matter where you're at on the depth chart. You can earn a job here. We don't care if you were a free agent, a first round pick. We don't care how much we're paying you. At the end of the day, if you're responsible for your job and you add value to the team, you will have an opportunity to play. And I think in some ways, that kind of approach to the offseason of, if I'm saying, okay, JP, I recognize that you want to play next year. And I'm just telling you that whether you put in 100 hours or no hours, or Johnny over here that you're competing with is here every day or not at all, it's going to come down to what is the job we're asking you to do and who does it better. So if you need to come in to prepare yourself, then I kind of leave that on you, right? Like to make that decision. Or if you need to go privatize your training with, a personal trainer or go play club or whatever it might be. But, again, laying out the standard of we're just going to open up competition. And these are opportunities that you have if you feel like you need them, maybe as a way to approach that where it puts the ball back in the player's court a little bit more. There's another aspect to this, JP, that can be frustrating when you're the in-season coach and your players are playing, like our players are playing indoor softball. They're playing club volleyball during our season, right? And we're asking a lot of our players as it is, right, in season. And I think at Mount Vernon, kind of the way that we've found peace between coaches is sort of to take this Phil Jackson approach, which is as long as you're doing your job for me, I don't care what you're doing outside of our practices or our season. So, you think of Dennis Rodman as the example. If Dennis Rodman wants to get on his motorcycle and go binge drinking for 3 days and be on a WWE Raw, in Las Vegas, as long as he comes back and can do his job for the Bulls, then Jackson would let him go. I'm not saying that we let our players do that, JP. Don't give me that look, all right? But at the same time, that's kind of the approach that I've taken when it comes to our in-season athletes doing these other sports is if you're going to go to volleyball twice a week or you're going to travel and play softball on the weekends, I'm fine with that as long as you can still do what we're asking you to do. And in some ways, that sort of, again, takes me out of the equation. It sort of gives the player control. Do I think that's always best for a player's mind and body? Maybe not, but it's not really my decision to make in the context of those families. And I think for us as a coaching staff or an athletic department at Mount Vernon, that sort of allows then softball players to play basketball at the same time, or for our kids to come in and shoot during the volleyball season, because we all sort of have this common expectation that as long as they do what's required of the in-season sport or coach, then they're going to let them do whatever they want to in the off season. What's tricky about all that, and this goes back to what you said before, is that would our basketball team be better if their day was structured like a prep school? Absolutely. If they spent 4 hours a day on basketball and then they did their classes and that's all they did, like we would be a way better basketball team this fall. So I do have to accept, like I've wrestled with this on the lawnmower, that we're not going to reach our potential. We just aren't, because we're not going to put the time in to see if we could ever get to that ceiling. And so my approach to that, which also can be difficult, is I'm just excited to see how good we can become. And that may seem like a cop-out in some ways, but I think for my own mental health, like that's the approach that I have to have if we're going to be sharing athletes between all of our sports.
So I actually really resonate with that last point there, because I think that's the approach that I've taken in this ultra marathon that I've been training for in September. It's 120 miles. I got to do it within 40 hours. And there's like all these training plans that I've looked at online and I've studied, and I am not doing what they recommend. I'm doing what I can do within the life that I've kind of created for myself when it comes to work and family. And when I set out for this big challenge, that was really important to me, is that I didn't not every other part of my life would start to suffer drastically. Definitely going to make some sacrifices, but I didn't want others to suffer, or other parts of my life to suffer because of this commitment. And I know I could increase my chances of success or improve my time if I followed the training plans. Absolutely know that. But there's part of this excitement of just kind of going into it. It's just like, hey, let's just see how well I can do at this, and I'm enjoying that opportunity. I want to kind of counter a little bit, because I know that we're talking a lot about surrendering control and just, hey, throwing it on the player, so much, to them in this off season type of commitment, or even in season. What I would say is, and I really talk a lot about this in the culture system, there's a whole chapter about player improvement plans where you sit down and you work with the players to talk about what their goals are, what their aspirations are. And I'm not saying we should just say, hey, whatever you want to do, you don't want to show up, we'll just see what happens. In those conversations, those player improvement plan conversations, you as the coach are helping them to identify their aspirations, where they are currently in relation to those aspirations, the things they need to do to close the gap between those things, or where they are and where they want to be, and kind of how can you support them in that. So a lot of times in those conversations, they will articulate, well, I want to be a starter next year. I want to get a college scholarship. I want to go play pro. That's great. But they're also articulating what they need to do, what they need to be committed to doing. Well, when they don't do that, then you are now empowered in many of these relationships to come in there and give them those reminders. And it feels different to them individually, because you're just coming back to not necessarily what your vision for the team is or what your vision for them is. It's about what their vision and their aspirations are for themselves. And you kind of just come in there and you can encourage. So there is, with a lot of our coaches, we still encourage a level of accountability or follow up with players in season and off season around these things, but only when you've had these conversations beforehand and you've gotten permission, per se.
Well, I think what you're describing there, JP, is that you're still putting control of the offseason decision-making in the hands of the player, but you're positioning yourself, rather than being the guy that takes them on a guilt trip, you're trying to be there to support whatever it is that their goals and aspirations are. And I think, we've talked many times about how the mind shift of a coach trying to get more to that mentor place where we're the guide and we're there to provide some aid and some support is a much better place than being the one that's the sheriff, trying to police their attendance in the offseason, both for the relationship with the player and the benefit of the player overall. That's a much better approach, I think, individually. Now, the other place where this becomes difficult is when you are coaching multi-sport athletes and you're not the priority sport. This is a conversation that we've had in our TOC community on our WhatsApp group here over the last week or so, of just a number of basketball coaches in particular that struggle because they have a number of players, the majority of their players on their teams, that are football players, but have to do an enormous amount of football in the summertime, which makes it difficult for them to play basketball. There can't be good basketball teams without their football players, but it would get into this conflict, right? If I just need my guys more, and then we kind of go down this negative spiral of, well, if I don't get them, then we're not going to be this good, and then we can't run this. And, that can be pretty debilitating, even in our own mental state as a coach. So how do we handle that when we're coaching multi-sport athletes, but our sport isn't the priority in their life?
Yeah, it's really difficult, but it's a reality, is that we're not the only coach potentially in our school that's really committed to our sport. I think the other challenge too is that I've experienced there is the other sport, the environment could be a very transactional type, coaching environment and not really align with what we're trying to create as far as a level of impact and connection and purpose driven, that's about more than just winning. And so, it affects not just even the level of commitment, but even just how they eventually do show up to our program. I think there's that challenge of they go from one sport to the next, and we have a very different philosophy and approach towards coaching. So how we manage this is really, really difficult. I think, and this is probably from your influence, I've really tried to encourage coaches to be more focused and more concerned, first off, about how players show up than how often they show up, especially in the off season. Really locked in on, are you showing up? Are you meeting our non-negotiables? And then we're just happy when you're here in the off season, in particular, if they've got other sports. Like, that's the first thing, is just, how do you show up? And then my focus would be to create an environment where they enjoy the process because they have a sense of control or autonomy over their development. They're connected to other people. They're part of a greater team purpose, of trying to achieve something. So if you just try to go and focus on the process of developing that team culture that's connected, that has this shared purpose, and that works hard and meets these standards, it makes you become more attractive, and you'll start to get more players in there. Now, I think the challenge is that process can be really, really slow, especially if you got a coach in your program that is using the blaming, the shaming, and all those tactics to try to when the players attend, your stuff over their stuff. Like it becomes very complex based upon your circumstances. But I really try to encourage coaches to first focus on how do they show up rather than how often they show up in the off season. And then when they do show up, don't be resentful that you only got 3 people there or only 10 people there and you want double that. Just be present, be fully engaged, and make it a great experience that they want to come back to.
I've thought about this a lot. I mean, like constantly throughout our off season and our circumstances here at Mount Vernon, because right now we probably out of 22 or 23 kids that'll play high school basketball this year have maybe 5 or 6 that would say basketball is their first sport. And so when you're not, the priority sport, I mean, obviously, number one, it's a challenge to get players in the off season, but there's also a little bit of a fear that if a player gets too busy, they're going to stop playing basketball so that they can play their other sports. Like, I think that's in the back of our mind as well, is like, we have to position ourselves in a place where we're keeping kids out, whether they're basketball first or not, especially if they're, athletic enough that they can help us in some way. So the way that we've tried to think about that is, number one, and this has been hard for me. All of these have been hard for me, I'm gonna be honest with you, but we just have to accept where we are. This isn't the same puzzle for me as what we had at Linn-Mar or Springville or the Wise and Muscatine before that. It's a different challenge. And to sit here and compare, what we did at other schools that worked, it just isn't going to work the same way at Mount Vernon. And I can sit here and bang my head into the wall and I can say, well, kids in the past or kids at other schools or kids that were great, they did this, this, and this. Doesn't do me any good. It also doesn't do me any good to compare my program to softball and volleyball, the most successful girls programs in our school, because again, the dynamics are different. They've got a more established youth program. They've been to the state tournament multiple times, won state championships. Like, there's a lot of things that just make that different for them. That it just doesn't do me any good to say, well, they have 60 kids out and we only have 20. They have this much time in the off season and we only have this because we're during the school year. It doesn't get me anywhere. And so just accepting, all right, here are the pieces in the puzzle that I have to figure out. That's been growth for me. Now, given that, I think there's also the challenge of, I need to recognize the things that I do have some control over that I can change. So, for example, instead of sitting here and saying, well, my varsity starters should be in X number of hours in the off season so that they can run this defense, this press, and this offense, I might have to change some systems here to say, look, if we're only going to get them for so much time, then we can only ask them to learn so much during the season for us to be successful. I'll take an example of we have a high major Division I volleyball player that is out for basketball. And she's 6'1", 6'2". She can jump and get the rim, JP. Like, she's an incredible athlete. Whether she touches a basketball in the offseason or not, she can make us better because of her athleticism. But we also have to recognize, like, we're not going to have a lot of time to have her be able to learn different ways to pick and roll coverages and, do a lot of exotic stuff with her, because we're more or less only going to get her during the season. So we've simplified what she does on offense. We've simplified the roles that she's going to play on defense, the coverages that we're going to use when she's in the game to try to get as much out of her. Still going to make us better. May not be what I would want to do with her if she was basketball first, a high level Division I athlete, but we just make the best of what we can in that context. And what's interesting about Chloe's story is that she told her volleyball coach this the other day over the summer. Volleyball coach was asking her about summer basketball and just basketball in general. And she said, I don't really love basketball, but I love my teammates and I love my coaches. And I think that comes back to what you were describing before, is when they do come in season or out of season, are we creating a place that they want to be, where they feel like they belong, where they feel like they get better, where they enjoy it? That goes a long way as well, I think, to, as you said, motivating them to come back. Here's the last thing I think that's been, again, this has just been hard. And I see this even in our TOC community chat. Our golden rule, and I heard this from Bruce Dahl, who is the head girls basketball coach at Dyke New Hartford in Iowa here. Dyke has had one of the best volleyball programs in state history. I mean, they're unbelievable volleyball years and years and years. And Bruce took over the program and basketball has been terrible. And everybody up until that point in the community said basketball will never be good because of volleyball. And so Bruce's number one rule for his staff, anybody associated with the basketball program, was we will never use volleyball as an excuse to not be successful in basketball. And further, none of us will ever blame volleyball for a lack of success. It can be done. And I think that's been something that's been really important for me at Mount Vernon is having successful volleyball and softball. It does create a different challenge for us. But if we're not successful, that's not the reason why. The reason is because I haven't been able to figure out the puzzle yet. And that's been, it's a mind shift where I'm trying to take responsibility and control for what we can control. But it's different than the way I've thought about it in the past.
Well, I'd say this. If I had adopted this type of mindset you're talking about, I would have had a much more successful program in my last go at high school coaching down in the South, down in Tennessee, because I was so caught up, first off, in how I wanted the team to play that I was really set in my ways around my systems offensively and defensively and what a great team looked like, that I wasn't willing to adapt to the circumstances. But also my mindset around, hey, I got to build this state championship team in 5 years, and that plan and what it would take for us to do that. And my inability to adapt and really shift my mindset created so much conflict within the team, with players. Just what you've shared there is just really, really powerful. And I think this can be really hard for a lot of coaches because, especially if we're listening to this podcast, we have desires. We want to be great. We want to have a great team. We want to have a great program. And so we have to, I think, really reflect internally and say, okay, can we maybe redefine what great looks like for this team at this school, in this circumstance? And if we can't do that, then we got to go find a job someplace else potentially, right? Because at the end of the day, like if you want to build this national powerhouse in this one school down in this one area here, like it probably is not going to happen if your sport is like at the bottom of their list and they're really, really successful in a lot of other areas, like it's just may not happen. And that's okay. Go find a job someplace else that is more invested and more into basketball if that's your sport. Like I don't know if that sounds harsh, but I think that's just the reality is like, if you're really set on this, 10-month program of high levels of commitment and, then just you may be in the wrong place if you're experiencing lots and lots of conflict around it.
Well, let me add one more thing here, JP. When it comes to making comparisons, I think another thing that's really hard for coaches in a situation like that is, I look at our league and I say, okay, the team that won the league last year, their first 8 players in their varsity rotation are all playing AAU in the summer. We have 0 kids playing AAU in the summer. I look at the team that finished second. They have half of their team, more than half of their varsity team playing AAU. They have no varsity starters on their softball team, and they have no players that are in their rotation that are playing volleyball. So they can go 10 months out of the year. And that's who we're competing with, right? To win our league and to go to the state tournament. So that can be pretty discouraging. But again, the place that we've tried to look at that and said, okay, if I don't have as much time with our team or our players during the season or during even their high school career, where can we make up time? Well, we start working backwards. Like, do they have to learn a motion offense in 4th grade and then transition to learning something different in 7th, 8th, or 9th grade? No, we can try to teach one system of play all the way through, and we can save some time. Can we make our practices more efficient? Can we find ways to get more shots per minute than what they are? And these are all little kind of 1% gains. But if you look at the totality of the program and say, kid comes in at 3rd grade, they leave in 12th grade, that's 10 years I got to work with them, to build them up to be a competitive basketball player. It's not just their junior year of high school and the offseason before their senior year, right? And so now I know that presents a whole nother issue of challenges that we can get into in another podcast. But I think that it's a place for us that's sort of like the untapped frontier of how can we become more deliberate, intentional, and efficient with every moment that they're in the gym with us, knowing that we just don't have as many moments to waste maybe as some of our opponents that we're competing with in our league. Now, JP, as we get ready to kind of wrap up this episode, you and I have been doing more and more work and having more and more conversations with ADs, and I'm excited to see TOC start to have some influence over entire athletic departments rather than just individual coaches. But I'm curious, JP, as we get out of here, if you could give an athletic director listening to this podcast today who's sitting here and thinking, man, I wish that we could shape our staff or mold our staff in a way that it was more conducive for players to be multi-sport athletes in our program, what's the one or two pieces of advice you would give to an AD that wants to bring that into their athletic department?
Absolutely, without a doubt. The number one thing that coaches are crying out for is greater communication and collaboration within the athletic department. So first off, you have to obviously try to get them into the room together and build some relationships and connect, which we really do love doing with athletic departments. But the other thing is to say, have this open line of communication, because everyone's circumstances are going to be different, like every school, right? But it's about, are we communicating and are we following through with what we've communicated on? So for instance, you guys could say, hey, this is our off-season plan. This is what we're working. And then everybody getting together and saying, well, that obviously works really well for your program. This would work really well for our program, but is that really going to work for our kids? And let's put the kids, the individual, the athlete at the center of the conversation and say, is this fair? Is this realistic? Is this healthy? And I think if we can get that communication going, coaches will start to maybe taper back a little bit of what they're expecting and potentially modify the plan there. When there's a lack of communication and continued communication and a relationship there, what you get is, I remember coaching years ago and down south, and you're working with the football program, and it's like, oh yeah, you'll do we'll do in the morning, you can do in the afternoon. And then all of a sudden the guys are showing up there, they're doing football from 8 until like 12 or 1, lifting and all these skills and all this stuff. And then they're like, oh yeah, go home and take a nap and come back here at 5, like after they've been in 100-degree heat for like 5 hours. And I'm like, I don't even want them. Like, I just stay home. Like, I'm like, what's the point of you coming here when you've pretty much ran a marathon in 100-degree heat out there? Like, it's just crazy. So I would encourage, I believe it is the athletic director's role, or the club, or director's role and responsibility to encourage that communication. And then potentially the second thing I'd say is to potentially set some standards here. And they have to, use their position to say, hey, we're going to have to tone it back in this area or in this sport here. Like, what you're trying to ask of your players, that's just not conducive with our overall mission of our athletic department.
I think that's great, JP. The only thing I would add to that is trying to create some mechanism for the athlete to have feedback, like to safely report on how they're actually feeling or how fatigued their body actually is, how overwhelmed they might feel. And we had some great conversation with the people from Hone in episode 249 and 250 of the podcast here recently that does just that. But I think in our situation at Mount Vernon, we don't really know for sure what it's like for the players to be pulled in so many different directions. And it may be okay. They may be handling it great, and they might not be. We don't know. And so I think any way that you can try to get some feedback from the student athlete about their experience, the better.
All right, that's it for today's episode. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And while you're at it, leave us a review. Help us to spread the word. Thanks again for listening in.